Welcome back to the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls around the world. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you all snuggled up and ready for another Lights Out bedtime story? Well, thank you for waiting, because you're in for a treat tonight. It's part 2 of the wonderful story of Henry Sugar by Roald Dahl, the book that I've been waiting for, the story that I've been waiting for about 30 years. Now, I told you about Henry Sugar yesterday, or just before, but one summer weekend, Henry drove down from London to Guildford to stay with Sir William Wyndham. The house was magnificent, and so were the grounds, but when Henry arrived on that Saturday afternoon, it was already pelting with rain. Tennis was out, croquet was out, so was swimming in Sir William's outdoor pool. The host and his guests sat glumly in the drawing room, staring at the rain splashing against the windows. The very rich are enormously resentful of bad weather. It is one discomfort that their money cannot do anything about. Somebody in the room said, "Let's have a game of canasta, for lovely high stakes." The others thought that a splendid idea, but as there were 5 people in all, one would have to sit out. They cut the cards, and Henry drew the lowest, the unlucky card. The other 4 sat down and began to play, and Henry was annoyed at being out of the game. He wandered out of the drawing room into the great hall. He stared at the pictures for a few moments, and then he walked on through the house, bored to death at having nothing to do. Finally, he mooched into the library. Sir William's father had been a famous book collector, and all the 4 walls of this huge room were lined with books from floor to ceiling. Henry Sugar was not impressed. He wasn't even interested. The only books that he read were detective novels and thrillers. He ambled aimlessly around the room, looking to see if he could find any sort of books he liked. But the ones in Sir William's library were all leather-bound volumes with names on them like Balzac, Ibsen, Voltaire, Johnson, and Pepys. Boring rubbish, the whole lot of it, Henry told himself, and he was just about to leave when his eyes was caught and held by a book that was quite different from all the others. It was so slim, he would never have noticed it if it hadn't been sticking out a little from the ones on either side. And when he pulled it from the shelf, he saw that it was actually nothing more than a cardboard-covered exercise book of the kind that children use at school. The cover was dark blue, but there was nothing written on it. Henry opened the exercise book. On the first page, hand-printed in ink, it said, "A report on the interview with Imrat Khan, the man who could see without his eyes, by Dr. John F. Cartwright, Bombay, India, December 1934. That sounds mildly interesting, Henry told himself. He turned over a page. What followed was all handwritten in black ink. The writing was clear and neat. Henry read the first 2 pages standing up. Suddenly, he found himself wanting to read more. This was good stuff. It was fascinating. He carried the little book over to a leather armchair by the window and settled himself comfortably. Then he started reading again from the beginning. This is what Henry read in the little blue exercise book. I, John Cartwright, am a surgeon at Bombay General Hospital. On the morning of the 2nd of December, 1934, I was in the doctor's rest room having a cup of tea. There were 3 other doctors in there with me, all having a well-earned tea break. There were Dr. Marshall, Dr. Phillips, and Dr. McFarlane. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," I said. The door opened, and an Indian came in who smiled at us and said, "Excuse me, please, could I ask you gentlemen a favour?" The doctor's restroom was the most private place, and nobody other than a doctor was allowed to enter it, except in an emergency. "This is a private room," Dr. McFarlane said sharply. Yes, the Indian answered. "I know that it is, and I'm very sorry to be bursting in like this, sirs, but I have the most interesting thing to show you." All four of us were pretty annoyed, and we didn't say anything. "Gentlemen," he said, "I am a man who can see without using his eyes." We still didn't invite him to go on, but we didn't kick him out either. "You can cover my eyes in any way you wish," he said. "You can bandage my head with 50 bandages and I will still be able to read you a book." He seemed perfectly serious. I felt my curiosity beginning to stir. "Come here," I said. He came over to me. "Turn around." He turned around. I placed my hands firmly over his eyes, holding the lids closed. "Now," I said, "one of the other doctors in the room is going to hold up some fingers and tell me how many he's holding up." Dr. Marshall held up 7 fingers. "7, the Indian said. "Once more," I said, and Dr. Marshall clenched both fists and hid all of his fingers. "No fingers," the Indian said. "Once more," I said, and Dr. Marshall clenched both fists and hid all of his fingers. "No fingers," the Indian said. I removed my hands from his eyes and, "Not bad," I said. "Hold on," Dr. Marshall said. "Let's try this." There was a white doctor's coat hanging from a peg on a door, and Dr. Marshall took it down and rolled it into a sort of long scarf. He then wound it around the Indian's head and held the ends tight. "Try him now," Dr. Marshall said. I took a key from my pocket. "What's this?" I asked. "A key," he answered. I put the key back in, held up an empty hand. "What's this object?" I asked him. "There isn't any object," the Indian said. "Your hand is empty." Dr. Marshall removed the covering from the man's eyes. "How did you do it?" he asked. "What's the trick?" "There's no trick," the Indian said. "It's a genuine thing that I have managed after years of training." "What sort of training?" I asked. "Forgive me, sir," he said, "but that is a private matter." "Then why did you come here?" I asked. "I came to request a favor of you," he said. The Indian was a tall man of about 30, with light brown skin and a color of a coconut. He had a small black mustache. Also, there was a curious matter of black hair growing all over the outsides of his ears. He wore a white cotton robe, and he had sandals on his bare feet. "You see, gentlemen," he went on, "I am at present earning my living by working in a travelling theatre, and we have just arrived here in Bombay. Tonight we give our opening performance." "Where do you give it?" I asked. "In the Royal Palace Hall," he answered, "in Acacia Street. I am the star performer. I am billed on the programme as Imrat Khan, the man who sees without his eyes, and in my duty to advertise the show in a big way. If we don't sell tickets, we don't eat." "What does that have to do with us?" I asked him. "Well, very interesting for you," he said. "Lots of fun. Let me explain." And that's the end of part 2 of the wonderful story of Henry Sugar here on the Lights Out podcast. Bedtime stories, finally, for boys and girls around the world. Good night.